K40 here. So I've been reading a lot of Richard Hanania's posts over the past few days. Just hit me. Guy's not serious, all right? He is very similar to Richard Spencer. There's nothing higher for Richard Hanania than himself and his own ego. So the type of post that you pin to the top of your Twitter feed, that's a pretty good way to get a read on somebody. And so this is what's important to Richard Hanania. This is what he wants you to know beyond everything else. I ran the numbers, and 1% of my newsletter subscribers have an email from one of the top 20 schools in the country. Right? That's the number one thing that he wants you to know about his work. That 1% of his newsletter subscribers have an email from one of the top 20 schools in the country. There is nothing higher for Richard Hanania than Richard Hanania's ego, his advancement in status, right? His standing, his prestige, his ability to capture your attention. He's very much like Richard Spencer. He differs from another self-aggrandizer, Mike Benz, in that Mike Benz does live for something higher than himself. Mike Benz is incredibly self-aggrandizing when he says that he ran cyber for the State Department, right? Completely ludicrous claim. But Mike Benz devotes himself to causes, right? He's devoted himself to free speech, to promoting Republicans, and that is above and beyond, right, his own amount of attention and prestige, right? There are things that Mike Benz believes in that are greater than Mike Benz. After reading a number of Richard Hanania's essays, I don't think there's anything that Richard Hanania believes in that's bigger than Richard Hanania. So here's an example. So Steve Saylor wrote a few months ago, New York Times writes, "Hooray, WNBA media bully Caitlin Clark. WNBA media bullied Caitlin Clark into denouncing critics of the racist and heterophobic violence perpetrated against her by black lesbians, and that's good for reasons of who. Time in my life, to the best of my adult life, that I paid attention to female basketball solely because of Caitlin Clark. All right, I watched the final of the college girls basketball championship solely because I'd heard so much about Caitlin Clark. And Steve Saylor notes something that was so obvious once he pointed it out, but I didn't notice it. Right, so I do know the WNBA has been struggling financially for as long as it's been in operation, and it could explode in popularity, right, if they simply equally enforce the law. So here's Steve Saylor noting, WNBA rookie Caitlin Clark has been exposed to vicious racist and heterophobic violence from black lesbians angered by a straight white woman horning in on their turf. Women's basketball administrators even shot themselves in the foot by leaving her their biggest star of the U.S. Olympic team. Now in the New York Times sports section, The Athletic, a columnist explains the real issue is that bad people are objecting to the abuse that Caitlin Clark has endured. Right? So Caitlin Clark is just getting hammered because she is white and because she is heterosexual. So Steve Saylor points out the obvious, which wasn't obvious to me until he pointed it out. And then, yeah. And how does Richard Hanania respond to a series of great points by Steve Saylor? So Steve Saylor says, it's time for a national conversation about racist violence in the WNBA. Richard Hanania snarked about my post yesterday about the season-long campaign of heterosexist and racist violence by WNBA black players against white rookie Caitlin Clark. And Richard Hanania, this is typical Richard Hanania. There's nothing higher to Rich than his own ego, his own aggrandizement. Caitlin Clark denounced the support from racist. Steve Saylor is not taking it well. Right? Do you really think that the upshot of Steve Saylor's post about Caitlin Clark getting hammered on a racist and heterosexist basis is really about Steve Saylor not taking it well? And Steve Saylor follows up, you can tell the baseball star Caitlin Clark supporters are racist because they object to Caitlin being subjected to racist and heterophobic violence by black lesbians who have 3 intersectional Pokemon points, while Caitlin Clark only has 1. Right? And so you see Clark just getting smashed right here in the head, like 2 seconds after Caitlin Clark shot, right? Smashed in the head by the forearm of her loudmouth rival Angel Reese. Right, Clark's shot was already 2 feet past Reese's hand when Reese hammered Clark in the head with her arm, knocking her to the floor. Reese was whistled for unnecessary roughness, but not for excessive rough. Like, one of these punches could kill someone, right? Women are much more fragile than men. Now, if the races were reversed, this would be a huge ongoing story, dwarfing even the Central Park Karen of 2020. But the New York Times treats the bigger story as bad people noticing the racist violence against the white woman and objecting to it, when all good people know that blacks can't be racist because they have no power, such as in the WNBA. Right? And for Richard Hanania, this is an opportunity to snark. Right? Because there isn't anything that he holds himself higher than Richard Hanania. All right. So he's histrionic. He's all over the place. There's this kind of uneasy feeling you get when you read him because he is dancing so hard for your attention. Right? He is consistently disagreeable against conservatives and Republicans because that's his niche. Like Richard Spencer, he wants to knock down every other pundit on the right, every other intellectual on the right, just smash them, right, to advance his own cause. But in so doing, he just looks petty and histrionic and completely acting as though he has no core. Right. On the other hand, this is what a serious observer sounds like. Right. Here is Mark Halperin today at the Democratic National Convention.
And there's a lot of pent-up desire to go to actual parties and hug and celebrate and greet. And they're being encouraged by the media. Now, the media is going to be cranky today because the line to get in here for the press is the longest line I've waited in since I went to Universal Studios in Osaka, Japan. It's a long line, and that'll make some reporters cranky, particularly when some media stars get whisked in. You might think this is a small thing, but trust me, this is how reporters feel in general and develop their views about the convention. However, mostly this is...
Right, this is what someone sounds like when there are things that they strive for that are greater than their own aggrandizement, right? Notice the calm, right? The willingness to offend multiple sides of the political spectrum, but not looking to offend for the sake of attracting attention.
This is going to be a celebration of the dominant media's love affair with Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party. I want to show you something that Politico wrote this morning.
Right. So Richard Hanania would snark about this kind of commentary. He snarks about conservatives complaining about biased media coverage. For Richard Hanania, his perspective, the media is great. Right? That's Richard. He wrote the media is truthful and good. It's one of his longer essays.
In their playbook, folks, if you can put that element up, is representative of the way the press covers the two sides. Go ahead and spotlight that story, please, if you would, so everybody can see it. This is got some language in it that I tweeted about that struck me, and says, so much is exciting and familiar. And then you see at the end of that paragraph, it talks about, it says, we're feeling that old buzz again. Those are not words that the press would have written about the Republican convention. And I've only been here about an hour, but it's so different when reporters see Democratic celebrities here, like Terry McAuliffe or Anita Dunn. They swoon and they come over and they ask friendly questions. When they see Republican celebrities in Milwaukee, they race at them and ask hostile questions. So it's just a reality of what's happening. So I would say on the Democratic side, there's still a lot not known. We know that AOC is speaking tonight. She announced that to her supporters in an email. We know the Bidens are speaking. We still don't know very much about the program. And so be curious to see who does speak. Hillary Clinton as well. And I expect that to be an extraordinary speech. Recall that in 2016, her real focus was on being liked, right? And so the speech was not particularly cutting. I would anticipate tonight you'll see one of the best speeches of her career, and a speech focused on the choice and the history of the Democratic nominee and how she feels about Donald Trump. So I would tune in for that. On the Republican side, interesting dynamics going on. The text of President Trump's speech today is right on message for what Republicans want to talk about. It came out just a while ago. I skimmed through it, and it is just paragraph after paragraph. I can't believe he's really going to deliver it, but he might. And I'll tell you why he might deliver it. Go ahead and put up Jim Garrity's tweet. Jim Garrity, the conservative writer, tweeted this earlier today, and it is exactly right regarding the mood of the party. Even some of Trump's biggest boosters and allies, Larry Kudlow, Kellyanne Conway, Nikki Haley, Kevin McCarthy, Peter Navarro, Vivek Ramaswamy, Sean Hannity, are begging him to stay on message, stop rambling about crowd size and imaginary helicopter rides with Willie Brown, stop attacking Brian Kemp, stop claiming Biden tried to have him assassinated, and stop saying that the presidential Medal of Freedom is better than the Congressional Medal of Honor. The biggest obstacle to Republican victory in 2024 is the Republican nominee. Totally true that that's what not only those people, but lots of Republicans think. Totally true that we all know Donald Trump hasn't executed that. If he does the speech that they have written for him today, he'll make those people happy. But I'll tell you what the problem is. The problem is that even some of the very people who are critical.
All right, so this is where you pay attention to Mark Halperin. All right, 100,000 Republicans have made that critique that Donald Trump can't stay on message. All right, but Mark Halperin's follow-up has not been made by anyone of which I'm aware.
Criticizing him are constantly putting stuff on social media and saying stuff on TV that is exactly like along the lines of what Trump does that they don't want Trump to do. So, for instance, Kamala Harris went to a convenience store in Pennsylvania, Sheetz convenience store, and there's a flap over.
All right, so there are 100,000 Trump critics who want him to stay on message and stop aggrandizing himself, but Trump's critics making this accusation can't follow the same message for themselves. All right, they have to aggrandize themselves as much as possible.
For that, and you see Chris LaCivita retweeting that. You see other Trump allies tweeting that. There's a connection between that and the economic argument, but it's not fully on message, and it's part of the kind of personal attacks that are a bit obscure for most voters. So my point is, they all find it irresistible. Trump does too, but it's harder to get him to do it because he sees these social media posts, he sees people on cable, he hears chatter from people, on the plane, on the phone, etc. And so they're asking him to do something that they themselves aren't really doing. And that right now, I think, is a big part of the tension in elite circles in the Republican Party, at least. The Democrats could not be more united right now. There's continuing the simmering tension between Nancy Pelosi and the Bidens, and the Biden people in general are relatively unhappy, although they may be happier after tonight and the reception he gets in the hall. But outside of that subplot, and it's a little strange, obviously, to refer to a subplot involving the incumbent president, Democrats here and around the country are super psyched and super united, and Republicans are dealing with this problem of Donald Trump. So when he gets underway, I want to dip in and give you a taste, but I assume at least he'll start on the text or get to the text before too long. And you can hear to see how you think he's doing. But before then, we're going to have conversation. Trump is underway. So let's dip into that before we get started with our talk.
Never seen before, but it surged for everybody during the Trump administration. Every group, everybody, men, women. We had every household was at a level that they've never really experienced before. The typical American household saw their incomes grow by more than $4,200 per year. Everyone was better off when you had a gentleman named President Donald J. Trump at the helm. Does anybody know him? Whoever he may be. I kept every single promise I made to the workers of Pennsylvania and to every other place within our country. On day one, I withdrew from the unfair job-killing Trans-Pacific Partnership.
So for every 20 posts that Richard Hanania makes about Donald Trump, 19 are snarky and negative. All right, so if you had that kind of ratio in your real life, right, you wouldn't be able to maintain any kind of relationship. Hanania is so eager to prove himself superior and more courageous than all other right-wing pundits that he spends probably 5 times as many posts, puts in 5 times as much effort criticizing Republicans compared to praising them. But he does have a new post out that's called Hating Modern Conservatism While Voting Republican. So, okay, you hate modern conservatism as opposed to what, right? Richard considers himself now a globalist liberal, right? Because Richard desperately wants above ground acceptance. And so he was an alt-right white identitarian for about 10 years, but now he desperately wants above ground acceptance. So he apologized for his identitarian phase. And now he identifies as a globalist and as a liberal. And so on what basis would he vote for Republicans? And this basis just shows how lacking in seriousness he is. He says, my main consideration is that economic growth is what matters. Right. We've never been closer to a nuclear war, with the exception of the Cuban Missile Crisis, than we are today, right? Due to our unnecessary involvement in Ukraine and incentivizing Russia to invade Ukraine. And now we are funding and arming Ukraine and considerably increasing tensions with another nuclear power. So living in a world where nuclear war has never been more imminent, with rare exceptions in history, right? His main consideration for voting Republican is economic growth, right? Donald Trump, whatever you think about him, he's the first president in many decades to not get us into a new war. Donald Trump, I don't think, would have funded Ukraine. Russia would not have invaded Ukraine. Hamas would not have invaded Israel on October 7th if Donald Trump had been president. All right, the Biden administration has engaged in absolutely reckless foreign policy adventures in funding Ukraine, and then Joe Biden flying to Israel to hug Bibi Netanyahu, completely unnecessary injection of the United States into these conflicts. And Biden keeps saying that we'll go to war to fight for Taiwan. Taiwan is not willing to fight for itself. Taiwan is not willing to take its own security seriously. Taiwan is not willing to spend to defend itself. Taiwan is not willing to sacrifice for itself. Taiwan is not willing to have a serious army. Taiwan is not willing to seriously train people to defend the island. Taiwan is not making any serious preparations to defend itself against invasion from China. But Biden keeps talking about how the United States will go to war to defend a country that has no interest in defending itself. To me, that's a serious issue. All right? Richard Hanania is voting for the 2024 election on the basis of economic growth. Right? Compared to the deadly issues, completely unnecessary tension that we have with Russia in particular, but also with China, and we have unnecessarily injected ourselves into the Middle East as well. All right, it just seems such a trivial basis to vote. Right. And Hanania is a big supporter of abortion, and he's also a big supporter of euthanasia. Right. He says if the Democrats came out unapologetically in favor of a Canadian-type system for euthanasia, then he'd seriously consider voting for the Democrats. Right. So if the Dems just changed their euthanasia policy, then Richard Hanania would seriously consider voting for them. And he doesn't like voting for Republicans because they'll give us more theocratically inclined judges who will completely foreclose the possibility of widespread euthanasia. All right, so judges are going to get their values from someplace. All right, do you want them to get their values primarily from socialism, or do you want them to primarily get their values from tradition? I don't think you should vote based on a general sense of cultural grievance. Why not? Why is culture not worthy of fighting for? All right, it's only not worthy for fighting for if you don't have a traditional hero system. And Richard Hanania does not have a traditional hero system, right? He is a globalist and a liberal. And I enjoy him. I enjoy the stimulation from his posts, but he's not a serious thinker. You can't take anything that he says seriously. He just doesn't seem to know what he's talking about much of the time. And he wrote about COVID in such a completely reckless way that because we have some estimates that 30,000 to 90,000 people die a year from the flu, and people in his estimation were dying in 2021 from COVID at a rate of about 100,000 a year. He thought that COVID was about 1.5 times more serious than the average flu. Right. Those numbers on flu deaths are estimates designed to promote people to take the flu vaccine. How many people do you know have died from the flu? How many celebrities do you know have died from the flu? Right. It almost never happens. Right. It's a made up number to push an agenda. On the other hand, COVID deaths are marked on death certificates, which are taken very seriously. All right. Your life will be ruined if you're reckless in the filling out of a death certificate. All right, you'll be done in that industry. So we know the numbers of deaths from COVID, and we know that COVID is approximately 8 to 10 times more deadly than the flu. Hanania makes these proclamations that once you get vaccinated for COVID, COVID is no longer a threat. This is insane, right? Anyone who says that shows that they know nothing and are not particularly interested in knowing anything. Taking the COVID vaccine provides some protection against hospitalization and death. It does not render you immune from dying from COVID. Right? It provides a measure of protection. Wearing a mask may provide a measure of protection. We don't have strong evidence for that. Common sense suggests to me that wearing a mask in crowded indoor settings may provide some level of protection, but there's no magic key that just inoculates you from COVID. Richard Hanania proclaims that children don't get COVID, don't suffer from COVID. We had 2,000 American children die from COVID in the first year of COVID, and tens of thousands more dealing with serious consequences from COVID. So he just can't be trusted on what he says, except as a stimulus for further thought, just like Richard Spencer and Mike Pence cannot be trusted on anything that they say, but it could propel you to do deeper research, and then if it's inspiring or energizing to you to look into something more deeply, then it's worth paying attention to these attention-seeking provocateurs.
And if I didn't do that, you wouldn't be open right now. You wouldn't have a job. That was a big thing. It was approved by another president. It would have destroyed our manufacturing in this country still further. I imposed historic tariffs on foreign aluminum and foreign steel and numerous other things that were unfair to our country and unfair to our workers. I ended the total disaster known as NAFTA, the worst trade deal ever made by this country, and replaced it with the brand new USMCA, that's Mexico and Canada, the best trade deal ever made by our country.
All right, let's dump that
I
out
will
of
tell you
business.
that I think the deal was.
We'll monitor it and maybe bring it back if we think something interesting is occurring. I want to bring in some folks to talk. If you want to get in on the conversation, please raise your electronic hand. Love to have questions, comments when people want to.
80s, yeah.
80s. All right, so not as diverse as I had hoped, but in any event,
Well,
guys, I'd love to hear just your general thoughts on this issue, either issue or both. Democratic unity and whether that lives all the way through the general, and this division within the Republican Party over Trump and his lack of discipline. John, you first. Just weigh in on either or both.
I think the Democratic unity is real in this fundamental sense, which is, I think by election day, even if Biden had stayed in, assuming that he could have held it together until election day, you would have seen these numbers of Democrats coming home in October, right? You would have seen 80 to 90% of Democrats saying they were going to vote Democratic. And that's just sped up. So she got in the race. It took 3.5 weeks for Democratic enthusiasm or Democratic coming homeness to happen. And now it's happened and it's there, and we can assume that it will stay there. Question now is we're just back in this 8% in the middle and where they're going to be. So the switcheroo did what it needed to do, and she has 4 days to make a case to people who are paying attention, who are who can be swayed to her side from Trump's side. And there's a little bit of evidence that independent voters are responding, at least to the idea that she's somebody new. They didn't want this race between these two guys. Now it's not a race between these two guys. That said, it's still a 1 point or a 2 point race, maybe. If I said to you that given the press of the last month, that she was ahead by 5 points, that wouldn't be surprising, right? It wouldn't be surprising given the kind of month that she's had. And she doesn't seem to be. So I just presume now that we have reached a new kind of equilibrium back where we might have.
So to me, COVID is often an excellent test for how serious a thinker is. And it's a test that Richard Hanania fails. So he writes here, right now, he writes in July 30th of 2021, and he says, we're on pace for 97,000 COVID deaths, right, in 2021. We had way over 400,000 COVID deaths in 2021. And he says, for sake of comparison, in 2017, 2018, about 61,000 people died of the flu in the US. Though the usual number of flu deaths is closer to 30,000. That's just an estimate. That's not based on death certificates. That is just promotion for selling the flu vaccine. So he claims, COVID's something like 1.5 to 3 times as bad as the flu now. And the gap between the two is going to be closing for the foreseeable future. We don't know that, all right? There could be a new version of COVID that's even more deadly than any version of COVID that we've seen so far. So COVID apparently has about over a 1% fatality rate, right? That's pretty high, right? And so he says the threat to children from COVID is almost zero, which is not true. The threat to the vaccinated is basically zero for vaccinated adults. Completely bogus. It just makes this stuff up. Right? He has no fidelity for the truth. All right? He's just completely reckless in the things he says. Right? He cannot be trusted. Oh, and speaking of reckless, right? He said about Shakespeare, Shakespeare is fake. When we have objective measures, the past is never better. So when Steve Saylor reviewed Richard Hanania's book, The Origins of Woke, Steve said, I admire Richard's intellect, but he needs to watch his ego. And now we see Richard declaring, Richard Hanania, I could copy Shakespeare's style and produce something just as appealing. And then to prove it, Hanania emitted what he assumed was a Shakespeare-like rhyming doggerel, not realizing that Shakespeare's greatest works are written in unrhymed iambic pentameter. Right? He just so frequently, so recklessly doesn't have the mildest clue about what he's talking about. Now, he's good at playing the game. All right? So he was exposed as an alt-right white identitarian who wrote for various white websites, and he then made a very effective apology. So Steve Saylor says, I'd already looked into this question of Richard posting as Richard Host, and I saw many similarities, but Richard Hanania was just so much better of a thinker and writer than Richard Host that I decided to remain agnostic on this mystery. So it turns out that Richard Hanania used to be a fat high school dropout, but now he has a law degree from the University of Chicago and a PhD from UCLA, and has recently become a prominent, skinny public intellectual. If he keeps improving at this rate, the sky is the limit. Still, although he has much to be proud of, Richard needs to watch his ego. His editors at HarperCollins do a good job of keeping it in check on the printed page, but online he's been boasting like a rapper. Why didn't anyone do any of this before? I don't think anyone else could have written The Origins of Woke. All right, this is just completely ludicrous point. Was there anything original in The Origins of Woke? Steve Saylor says, I have several books on my bookshelves from as far back as the 1970s that cover the same material as Richard Hanania does in The Origins of Woke. It's a dry topic. Conservative intellectuals tend to forget lessons once learned in favor of highbrow speculations about cultural Marxism, and therefore they need periodic reminding, such as The Origins of Woke. A lot of good stuff on today's Mark Halperin stream.
Expected it to be anyway, and that means that she has an opportunity to close the sale with independents, and Trump or Republicans have an opportunity to close the sale with independents or unaffiliated voters between now and November. So on the one hand, it's been a wildly successful period, and on the other hand, it's not like we're seeing her pull away, or which it feels that way if you're us. Like,
right, her momentum has stalled. All right, she got shellacked in the mainstream media on Friday in reaction to her ridiculous price gouging allegations with groceries. So she got her first bad press on Friday, and she has stopped rising in the polls. In fact, her lead has begun to diminish over the past 5 days.
and you're monitoring this granularly on an hour-to-hour basis, but there's just no evidence of that.
Dan, you, during the end days of the Biden campaign, you were very sensitive to how much division and tension there was. There's reports of some tension in Wilmington between the Harris people and the Biden people. There's this Pelosi Biden thing. But in general, are you finding kumbaya and happiness and joy, that important 2024 word within your party now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the old, JFK, victory has 1,000 fathers and defeats a lonely orphan. I mean, right now people sense, it's possible to win. And yeah, I mean, the tension in DC, I think there's still obviously very hurt feelings there. The one issue that I think still, and I mentioned this morning, kind of boils under the surface is the Israel, Hamas or Iran kind of Palestinian issue. That is still simmering. I mean, both Biden and Kamala have faced some protests, even, recently. I think we'll see what happens here this week, whether there's an event, they start firing at each other, whether somebody gets up at the convention. But I think, yeah, as a rule, there's great unity. She seems to not be doing as well with Hispanics as I think they would like. She's doing better than Biden did, but Trump is still not doing, is still doing significantly better than most Republicans. And I think that's reflected in Arizona and Nevada, kind of still not having too much movement the way you're seeing in Georgia and North Carolina. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's great excitement.
Yeah, Mark Halperin is on location in Chicago at the Democratic National
There's
Convention.
optimism, but
To be, as the Republican convention was, a very well-produced show. Spielberg's involved. A lot of veterans of convention production are involved. And I would expect, we know the marquee tentpole speakers, and I'd expect them all to be red light performers and do quite well. We don't know who the everyday people are. We don't know who some of the other speakers will be. We know Adam Kinzinger speaking, but I suspect from what I've heard, there'll be other Republicans and other former Trump people. And again, what does it take to produce a good convention? You need a well thought through program. You need good speakers. You need an enthusiastic crowd in the room, and you need the press corps to lap it all up. And I think all the elements are here for that right now, at least so it appears. I want to ask you guys one more thing, and then again, I encourage folks, if you want to get into the conversation, please raise your hand. I want to ask you guys about this issue of whether Democrats are being too irrationally exuberant. We all think the race is close, and she may have an edge today with momentum, but things can change, as we know. Is there a danger to Democrats? Harris said again yesterday she's the underdog. Is there a complacency danger? Is there what's the danger for being exuberant? Because to me, it's giving them a lot of sort of supercharging the momentum. So is there a danger to being too bullish on her chances now? What's the downside?
I'll say I think for certain.
Okay, so Richard Hanania had a conversation January 11th, 2024 with Nathan Cofnas, right? And it's a good illustration of the difference between serious and attention seeking.
Yes, scientific and philosophical questions.
This is Cofnas.
Including evolution of intelligence in science and evolution of morality, implications of findings in moral psychology and the evolution of morality for the nature of morality and moral application.
Yeah, early career.
So both Nathan Cofnas and Richard Hanania have PhDs, right? Cofnas is in a much more difficult area, philosophy and biology. Philosophy, the academic discipline that attracts the highest average verbal scores, and biology also is pretty formidable discipline. Richard got his PhD at UCLA in a much softer discipline, political science.
Oh, so what's that job like in the American context? Fellowship, associate professor. Like, what is it? A permanent job?
Postdoc. It's equivalent. It's a 3-year postdoc. Especially for me, requires a certain amount of miracle. I'm getting the Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship at Cambridge. There are more people who apply than are admitted by quite a lot, actually. But in the UK, they're 10 years behind the US in terms of wokeism and enforcing this orthodoxy. But still, it was really shocking because when I apply for the position, I have to be nominated by the philosophy faculty. Then there's an internal competition among the university. So all departments nominate 1 or 2 people, and then there's an internal competition. They select 1 out of 6 in the internal competition, and then it goes.
So Phil Donahue died. I read his biography, and I used to watch his show at times during 1983, 84, often with my father, and he'd say to me, "I'm going to be on there one day." It never happened. My father never reached the level of success that he hoped for. So Nathan Cofnas speaks slowly. I'm speeding him up here to 1.5 speed, but he also speaks slowly because he takes what he says seriously. All right. While for Richard, words are just tools that he uses for his own aggrandizement.
To the Leverhulme Trust, and then they have to approve it, and that's
right. Is that the original paper that got you in trouble?
Yeah. So when I was a PhD student at Oxford, I wrote a paper which also miraculously was published in the journal Philosophical Psychology, which was a quite respectable mainstream journal, where I argued that, although I had to hold back a little bit because you have to get through peer reviewers, I said the evidence is suggesting that there could be race differences, and I argue that if this is the case, we need to be open to what the evidence says, because there are a number of philosophers and scientists, very prominent people, who have said it doesn't matter what the truth is. These facts are just too horrible. It's too unethical to even consider the possibility that this is true. So we should just dismiss it on moral.
So like Richard Spencer, Richard Hanania is on the warpath to try to knock down all competing right-wing intellectuals and pundits. So he damns Steve Saylor with faint praise. Steve Saylor is insightful on many things, but if you assign him an article on housing, littering, or any issue really, he'll just turn into a tirade against immigration. That bears absolutely no resemblance to reality. It's such a cheap put down. Right, this is from Richard Hanania's lengthy essay, "Shut Up About Race and IQ." Well, noticing that different people have different gifts is one of the most important ways that you can more clearly discern reality and make better choices. Right? It's such a powerful tool for understanding how the world works. But Richard Hanania wants to make the case to stop talking about this because when he talked about it, he was in danger of blowing up his career. So for Richard Hanania, there are many things far more important than telling the truth. Right? What's far more important than telling the truth is Richard Hanania's status and advancement and having a good life. All right, Steve Saylor, like Charles Murray, all right, there are many things that these blokes believe in that are greater than their own status. Right? Hanania says, I searched Steve Saylor's blog for littering, and practically every result on the first page was somehow connected to Latinos or immigrants. Right? So Steve Saylor noticed that in some areas of Los Angeles that have started to become heavily littered, that it was overwhelmingly Latino immigrants who were using those areas. Right? And Richard Hanania says, I tried the same thing with global warming, and the results weren't as extreme, but the pattern was similar. It's as if when you brought up stamp collecting with someone, they shifted the conversation to how Armenians are always trying to pass off counterfeit stamps as the real thing. You would start to think that this person cares more about Armenians than about stamps. All right, Steve Saylor focuses on those topics where he can provide insight that you're not going to read in the New York Times. And so he also develops certain specialties, but he so consistently produces important insights that you don't get elsewhere that these criticisms are so cheap here coming from Hanania. Imagine a leftist coming along and saying, all you have to do is show Saylor that Latinos don't litter all that much, and then he'll support immigration. Obviously, the whole littering obsession is a pretense. It's not a pretense, right? You can notice that different groups have different approaches to litter, right? In the world that I come from, of California in the 1970s and Australia in the 1970s, right, you had the beginnings of pretty intense anti-littering campaigns. But some groups in America don't really care that much about littering. And the same is true for other right-wing figures who've talked about littering, like Ann Coulter and Tucker Carlson. Right? I think they're just noticing patterns, and Ann Coulter and Tucker Carlson are willing to talk out about things that are greater and more important than their own egos and their own advancement. Immigration restrictionists are mainly driven by aesthetic preferences. Right? What an insane analysis. Obviously, different people have different gifts. You can bring to your country people who are 10 times more likely than the average American to commit murder, or you can choose to bring people into your country who are much less likely than the average American. To me, that's far more significant than aesthetic differences. So go back to Richard Hanania's incredibly shallow critique. Immigration restrictionists are mainly driven by aesthetic preferences, partly in the most literal sense. That is, what people in the country should look like. Well, what people look like isn't just about what they look like, right? It tends to be a giveaway of a whole host of traits that can help to build up and advance a society or tear it down and destroy a society, right? Different groups have different gifts, different tendencies, different weaknesses, and at a glance, you can often get a sense of what's going on, right? If you see someone dressed in a suit, all right, you get an impression of that person that's quite different than if they're walking around with their pants, down their ass. Talking about group differences in IQ is not the way to influence or ultimately defeat the left. The more individuals accept group differences between the races, the more they want society organized to satisfy the preferences of the worst whites and to make excuses for their behavior. What planet does he live on? Right? Plenty of non-white people accept that different groups have different gifts, and it has virtually nothing to do with satisfying the preferences of the worst whites. He just makes stuff up in a completely reckless way that bears no basis with reality, but it is politically advantageous for him.
Grounds, and I argue against that. And as part of that argument, I review the evidence that I say this is a live possibility. This can't be just dismissed as.
So one of the biggest differences between Richard Hanania and serious intellectuals like Nathan Cofnas is that people like Steve Saylor, Nathan Cofnas, Charles Murray are first and foremost about the evidence. Richard Hanania does not want his theories and his online ploys for attention to be restricted by facts and evidence. So he ventures way out there where the buses don't run no more, but where the facts aren't applicable. He wants the freedom to spin narratives and stories and attention-getting ploys, and he doesn't want to be fenced in by facts, right? In this sense, he's like Neil Ferguson, right? They're both about self-aggrandizement and don't hold me back by the facts, man.
Pseudoscience or flat earthism. So I was very disappointed by the initial reaction to the paper. It got 4,000 or 5,000 views, which is not far from being viral. But I was rescued by this philosopher, Mark Alfano, who launched a petition to retract the paper and to fire the editors who were responsible for it. So long story short, it's now has 75,000 views. It's the most viewed paper in the history of the journal. Although some...
So there's a comment in the chat that Nathan Cofnas has never contributed anything. Well, he spent a year and decoded Kevin MacDonald's Culture of Critique book. All right, this is a book that has changed thousands of lives, sometimes for dramatically worse life results. So you hear about people such as, is it Paul Little? Who was it? The bloke who claimed that he quit a $130,000 a year job to drive for Uber because his mind was so blown by Culture of Critique. Well, Nathan Cofnas took a year, and studied the sources and of culture of critique and decoded and explained the book. He was the first serious intellectual to delve into Kevin MacDonald's book, and he did a great job.
I was sorry that some innocent people had to pay a price for that. So one of the editors resigned to protest the fact that the editorial board was.
Comment in the chat. Do I understand that for every Cofnas, there is a Jimenez who will debunk any noticing about their group? Okay, name me these Jimenezes. I don't know any important intellectuals who talk about these topics with the name Jimenez. There may be some. I am unaware of any.
Was bowing to some of Alfano's demands, and then the other editor apparently was fired. But anyway, I got the message out there.
Yeah.
And when I got to Cambridge, this article in philosophical psychology was discovered by some of the students, the student journalists. And so they wrote what was, I guess, supposed to be a hit piece about me. But what they said is they quoted me saying like the truth is important or something like that, but trying to paint it in a very sinister way. But how could I get in trouble for this? It didn't make any sense to me. So that, I think, fell flat, but it was picked up by the Daily Mail, and they kind of spun it as I'm a racist. But it was, the Daily Mail article was so poorly researched and just making
it's a very stupid paper that usually it's like sort of right wing, but it's like too dumb to like know what's right wing and left wing. So it occasionally does this, and it'll occasionally come out like this guy is a big racist. And so I think your article is sort of in that vein. So nobody bothers you on a daily basis in Cambridge now?
No, not at all. Not at all.
Somebody told me in classics that like Oxford, they told me Oxford and like Cambridge, like elite UK academy, said it's 10 years behind the US. But someone told me it's even better than that. It's actually like there's a lot of sort of right wing people in analytic philosophy and classics. Is that right? Because I don't know how you get through all the you couldn't get I think you could get a fellowship in America. I mean, it's just unthinkable. Like they would allow this at this point in our the history of American university. Is it just 10 years behind, or is there actually like a lot of right wing representation?
Well, I was not able to get into a single philosophy PhD program in the United States. So I know that they won't care, but for the people who say that, Cofnas only got into Oxford and Cambridge because he's a Jew, in fact, Jews have way more influence in America at American universities.
Why do they think you got in because you're a Jew? Do they have favoritism in Cambridge? Is that what people think?
Right. So Jews can just, whenever they feel like it, they can just go to
Oxford
or Harvard. I chose Oxford instead of Harvard. So there wasn't a single person in the whole either permanent or temporary faculty in the philosophy department at Cambridge, not a single Jew before I came. So, and I know for a fact that the people involved in hiring me weren't Jewish, but
but they picked you. They like the Jew who talked about race science. So that tells us something about sort of where they're at, doesn't it? I mean, that's incredible that you got a job. I mean, it's just not thinkable in America.
Yes. So I haven't gotten. I'm very happy. I got MPhil at Cambridge, DPhil at Oxford. Now back at job at Cambridge, and it couldn't have worked out better. But in fact, I didn't have a choice because no one in America was giving me any offer, either for a PhD program or a job.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get some more analysis on the convention here from
cable
Mark
news
Halperin.
and Twitter, for as much as that's not the real world. That like now everyone's kind of so many Democrats just loathe Trump. They don't understand why people vote for him, which I think is really dangerous. They don't ask kind of why people vote for him.
But Dan, what's the? I understand the mindset, but as long as they're giving money and volunteering, what's the downside?
Because I don't think you will go through from now to November and not hit a speed bump. And I think,
but so what if they hit a speed bump? I'm serious.
Okay, so if you're
tilt the ideological axis toward Trump, I don't think calling for price controls. Yeah. I don't think calling for price controls is a smart move.
But is that a product of exuberance on the part of the voters and the commentarian?
No, I think it could be her, it could be them, it could be what they think they want to preach. Could be that they don't have at their fingertips the feeling of what this American electorate really is. Kamala Harris is somebody who is a political product of the state of California and Northern California politics. And it's not clear to me that she, to the extent that she's in charge, knows that much about what people who are not like her think, or what it is. She can read information, she can read reports on focus groups, she can read polling, but she may not know that saying things like price controls cause inflation and inflation is a problem and I don't like hearing what I'm hearing is something that small businessmen across the country don't have a problem hearing. Okay,
it's an interesting point, but I don't see what it has to do with my theory that it's the upside of being exuberant is greater than the downside.
Oh, I think totally totally in this moment, without question, it's better for your audience, for the people who are backing you, to be excited than to be depressed. The question is whether she, I think like Hillary in 2016 and others, part because of that loathing of Trump and some other things, don't understand where the Democratic message starts tilting into ordinary.
And Halperin comes with another great point that you don't get in most political coverage, right?
People
So,
going,
listen
ooh,
up.
they sound like crazy liberal lunatics.
Okay. I want to raise one other topic. Then I want to bring folks in again. If you want to get in the conversation, raise your hand. I get emails.
So when your thinking is not primarily shaped by the need to put yourself first and get the most attention, right? It calms you down, right? So from a calmer place, you're going to have a wiser understanding of reality, and you have all this cognitive processing power that is then freed up away from self-aggrandizement to notice what's going on in the world around you. And this is what you get from people like Mark Halperin.
In text every day now, and I see it on cable and in social media. Anti-Trump people saying he's crazier than he's ever been. He's lost his mind. He's totally different because he's under so much pressure because Harris has big crowds and he's behind the polls. I think Trump is every bit as crazy as he was in 2016. I don't understand it. So am I wrong? Is he by some measurable metric or in some subjective way crazier than he was in 2016 in terms of what he says? I don't think so, because I could give you 1,000 things he said in 2016 crazy. So do you agree with me, or do you agree with the people who tell me, and I hear people say, this is it, he's lost his mind, I can't believe it, this guy could never win because he's too nuts, and he says nothing?
I think that the people who hate him are going a little nuts, because there's stuff that he is doing to amuse himself that I don't think is particularly effective or is even like smart, because he should be focused and taking seriously this battle. But he's got a kind of nihilistic sense of humor that doesn't appeal to me. But like when he says things like, I'm much better looking than she is, that's a joke, people. Like, I know Ron Filipowski doesn't think it's
right. You don't read an electricity bill the same way that you read a sext message, right? You don't read the newspaper the same way that you read Shakespeare. And you don't read a joke, right, the same way that you read a serious political proposal.
It's a joke, but it's a joke. He's joking. It's not really funny. It's like a joke that isn't really funny. And I'm sorry, but I hate to put it this way, because I think what he said was disgusting. But I think it's better to win the Medal of Freedom than it is to win the Medal of Honor, because, you might be dead when you win the Medal of Honor, but you're alive when you win the Medal of Freedom, is like a really bad joke. I mean, it's a genuinely tasteless and bad joke, but it is a joke. He doesn't mean it, because he often doesn't mean anything. And I think there the calibration is, if you're just, every word that comes out of his mouth is going to strike the people who hate him so much as the ravings of a madman who needs to be thrown into a lunatic asylum, fine. But there's a lot of people in America who aren't going to have that reaction to all of this. And the reinforcing nature of the media, Twitter, Democratic information bubbles, and all.
This is only his third campaign. It's the first time he's facing an opponent who's a little more nimble online and a little better at playing this up and kind of with humor and memes. And like Kamala, it is night and day, obviously, from Biden, but even Hillary's campaign was not nearly as clever. I just think they didn't know how to really take on.
Right. Kamala Harris's campaign is formidable, right? The people who are operating her campaign are doing an amazing job considering who they're working with. Right? I used to like to put down a friend of mine by saying, oh, you get more out of your talent than anyone I know. Well, the people running Kamala Harris's campaign are getting more out of her talent than anyone else. I mean, that they have pushed her to the top of the polls is amazing. So I enjoy the podcast If Books Could Kill, right? A couple of lefties, but they make some good points. And here they are on Richard Hanania's The Origins of
so
Woke.
Fucking stupid. I regret choosing it.
No zinger, just you complaining, and then bum 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 bum.
I'd put in like a week of work into this before I was like, shit, this was a mistake.
Yeah, for the first time, we're doing a bad book on the show. Incredible. A book that could kill, one might even say.
It makes me so mad that this book is called The Origins of Woke.
Dude.
Instead of Wokeness.
It does sound vaguely like some sort of business self-help book that we would also cover on this show. It's a parable of great.
All right. Okay. Michael.
Peter.
What do you know about The Origins of Woke?
All I know is that this is going to be the first time we're doing an episode that requires not only an internet connection, but a pair of calipers.
Okay, calipers are devices that you could use to measure someone's skull. I had to look up calipers. So, come on, guys.
All right. The Origins of Woke. This is a book by Richard Hanania, came out last year. Little look behind the curtain.
Ooh.
When you go 2 or 3 months without releasing a podcast, what you want to do is come back with a book that no one's ever heard of.
And that our irritation with doing it is palpable. Yeah. We don't want to be here.
A big problem for our show is that conservatives keep putting out books complaining about wokeness.
Yes.
All of which are exactly the same.
The same way they're running out of ideas, we're running out of things to say about their ideas. Yeah.
What makes this one interesting and I think worth covering, it's not about like the abstract cultural origins of quote unquote wokeness. Hanania does not talk about Foucault or like any other postmodern theory. He blames civil rights laws for the modern cultural context. And that is the premise of.
Okay, so they're laughing, and this is the same reason that many Democrats think that Republicans are weird, is that it's a violation of their hero system, right? For a liberal left hero system, civil rights are the epitome of the sacred. For people with traditional perspectives on, say, private property and freedom of association, all right, civil rights are a new constitution that in many ways has superseded our original constitution. So weird is the epithet you often hear when dealing with a contrary hero system. But if the opposition or the challenge from this contrary hero system is more intense, then people start using creepy, as in creepy ethno-nationalist. Right? That simply means someone with a hero system that challenges and threatens my hero system. So if you read Ronnie Goldman's book, right, Conservative Claims of Cultural Oppression, it's just 100 times more deep than Richard Hanania's efforts. And 100 times more deep than if books could kill podcasts, but not nearly as well-spoken and amusing.
This book.
I'm imagining him quietly putting away a dog whistle and just pulling out a whistle. It's like, look, we're just saying it at this point.
That is, I think, the purpose. This is not aimed at a popular audience. This is aimed at powerful conservatives, especially, I think, the next Trump administration.
Yeah.
Which I think is why it's worth analyzing, despite the fact that we've talked about wokeness before.
Although one.
Yeah, so the news media is turning on Kamala. It began most dramatically on Friday. So let's get a burst here from Jesse Waters on Fox.
But most Biden voters, they don't even know what Kamala stands for. They're completely unaware of Kamala's policies. Look at this. No idea about eliminating private health insurance, abolishing ICE, being the most liberal senator, pushing for the Green New Deal, or even defunding the police. They have no idea. It's up to Trump now to break through the cover-up. Even the liberal media is saying enough is enough.
She has served as an undistinguished, nearly invisible vice president. Thus far, Harris has had a free ride. She's not given any media interviews, hasn't faced voter questioning. Sooner or later, she's going to be held accountable and face pressure that she has thus far largely avoided.
That's the point. And people are starting to notice. The Little Princess's crowds are shrinking back to Biden size. That's called shrinkflation. Kamala's popping into small little tents with just a few dozen people, speaks for 15 minutes, then runs back to the safe space on her bus with walls as her security blanket. Poor Princess Kamala. Campaigning is hard. O'Leary Ventures chairman Kevin O'Leary joins me.
Okay, let's get more analysis here from If Books Could Kill, the Origins of Woke.
I think I was going to say, I was going to try to turn this into a zinger, but like, you know how Lady Gaga has like little monsters and Taylor Swift has Swifties? Mm-hmm. I was going to say that like this dude's fans should be Hananiacs, but then that requires him to have fans.
Right.
And like,
right.
Other than fucking center-left journalists who are like, these ideas are important to take seriously, I haven't actually seen all that many conservatives say that they like this guy. I think there's something where like even conservatives can tell that someone like Hanania is just a fucking worm.
Appearance vampiric.
He has like the overall demeanor of like Robert Blake in Lost Highway. He's like a fucking haunted doll that you would find at like your grandmother's house after she dies under mysterious circumstances.
He does look like one of those creepy little ventriloquist dolls.
He really does.
But more reptilian, more snake-like almost.
Exactly. Less likable.
If it was between living in a home with him and the doll from Goosebumps, I'd probably just choose the doll. We don't need to go into his background too much. He's a conservative writer, think tank guy. He's appeared in many op-ed pages over the years, the Times, the Post, the Atlantic, all the biggies. This book is about the origins of modern wokeness.
Mm-hmm.
Blissfully, he does try to provide a workable definition of wokeness.
Okay.
He says that wokeness has 3 central pillars. I'm going to send them to you.
So, the 3 pillars of wokeness. 1, the belief that disparities equal discrimination. Practically any disparity that appears to favor men over women or whites over non-whites is caused by some combination of past and present discrimination.
So you can hate the ideological underpinnings of this podcast, but it's one of the most popular podcasts in America, and it's a podcast about books. So these guys know how to podcast.
Disparities that favor women over men or non-whites over whites are either ignored or celebrated. This includes not only material outcomes like differences in income or representation in high-status professions, but disparities in thought or stereotypes about different groups. 2, speech restrictions. In the interest of overcoming such problematic disparities, speech needs to be restricted, particularly speech that suggests they are caused by factors other than discrimination or that stereotypes are true. 3, human resources bureaucracy. In the interest of overcoming disparities in regulating speech, a full-time bureaucracy is needed to enforce correct thought and action. I like that we're already resorting to like things that annoy me by
absolutely.
Pillar 3. It's just like HR managers, the trainings we have to do.
So I will give him some credit, I guess, for providing something of a concrete definition here. His book is mostly built around the idea that what like woke liberals believe is that any disparity between demographics must indicate discrimination, right? This is a very common argument from conservatives, though. I don't think I know anyone on the left, at least anyone serious, who actually believes this.
It's an interesting mirror to the conservative belief, which is that disparities must be caused by the inherent nature of those groups.
That's the irony here, is that he creates what I think is a straw man, where he says liberals believe that every disparity is discrimination. Now, even if you believe that that's what liberals believe, you can say that's wrong without adopting his position.
So if you don't listen to left-wing critiques of right-wing ideas, you're essentially playing tennis with the net down, right? You have to listen and consider left-wing critiques of right-wing ideas, or you're just in a bubble, right? You're not mature. You truly lack sufficient confidence in your own abilities to understand things, and you are just resorting to living in a fantasy world if you can't stand up to listening to critiques of what you hold sacred. And this podcast, left-wing podcast, if books could kill, right? They do an excellent job often of critiquing right-wing tropes.
Which is basically any disparity is justified and pre-exist and is the will of God.
It's also going to be very funny noticing the parallels between this and Yasha Monk, who's like allegedly this kind of serious center-left person. His definition of woke also had this like tripartite structure, like the 3 legs of the stool or whatever.
Yeah. When you can't provide like a clean definition of something, you have to be like, oh, it has 3 pillars. You just start like talking out your ass. Like, oh, it's not one thing. It's actually 5 elements.
It's actually a 10-minute sequence in a Terrence Malick movie where you're just sort of dreamily drifting through landscapes.
So this book has several components. I'm going to focus on the elements that are targeting the workplace.
Okay.
We start off with an anecdote about the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He tells the story of how originally the law only forbid discrimination based on race, color, national origin, and religion. The reason that sex was added to that list was because an opponent of the bill, Howard Smith, proposed it as an amendment. Smith was an opponent of the bill. He was adding gender in order to undermine its likelihood of passage.
Right. This is a famous poison pill attempt.
Yeah. Hanania says the story of how sex discrimination became illegal and how the definition of discrimination changed over time tells us something fundamental about how the American system works. In the simplified version of constitutional law presented to school children, Congress passes bills, the executive branch enforces them, and courts interpret the law. But in the hands of bureaucrats, executive agencies, and judges, the text can take on a life of its own.
Ooh. Judges be out here doing interpretations.
So I guess his whole point here is that this is an example of how something can become law without really reflecting the beliefs of society or maybe even the beliefs of legislators.
Right.
The problem with this story is that it's kind of half myth. Like Hanania.
So let's take a scroll down through Richard Hanania's Twitter feed. And Richard Hanania wrote an article saying that he was going to vote Republican. This is a rare article that lost me subscribers right and left, but I must continue telling you the truth. All right. He's not particularly concerned about telling you the truth. He is concerned about developing a reputation, developing a status, developing attention, and he will manipulate or ignore truth if it gets in the way of his thirst for attention. Liberals, your economic views will make us all poor and miserable. Right? That's not true. Right? There are many prosperous socialist countries, such as in Northern Europe. Conservatives, you don't respect women. Right? This idea that conservatives don't respect women is such a pathetic critique, and are in an orange man cult. Right? There are plenty of people on the right, Republicans, conservatives, who do not particularly care for Donald Trump, but the wise person, right, has to choose between alternatives. You don't get to choose your ideal spokesman, your ideal candidate. You have to deal with reality. And people who don't like many things that Donald Trump says and does, right, still support him. Why? Because they believe in things greater than themselves, right? Unlike Richard Hanania, they have values, they have goals, they have a hero system, right? They have priorities that are greater than their own self-aggrandizement. Right, and so this is how Hanania paints your average Republican. Conservatives are the stupid party. They're also bigoted, dishonest, and anti-democracy. So he buys into the argument that Republicans are anti-democracy. There are elements of conservative thought that want to hold democracy in check. There are elements of left-wing thought and liberal thought that want to hold democracy in check. The idea that Republicans are some unique threat to democracy is not a serious argument. And his whole basis for voting Republican is economic growth matters most. Right? When we have unprecedented threats from Russia and China, the idea that economic growth matters most. Just make sure to apologize to women and minorities when you vote Republican. It's such pathetic, low-level trolling. I think post-liberalism is just a mood. Look, all political ideologies, right, are better and worse in different circumstances, right? In some circumstances, a liberal democracy is the most effective system for allowing people to perpetuate their nation, their state. And in other circumstances, a xenophobic police state is more successful, right? There are times when post-liberalism is more effective for some problems, and there are other situations where liberalism or leftism or communism or socialism is more effective, or capitalism, right? It depends on the situation, right? It's not like there's one political ideology, including Richard Hanania's globalist embrace of liberalism, that is always best. I think post-liberalism is just a mood, Hanania says. People who are just sad or angry by disposition and think everything sucks. But it's more a psychological issue than anything. There's no alternative, and most people aren't that miserable. Liberalism won. Really? The world has not been becoming more liberal over the past 15 years. The world has steadily become less liberal over the past 15 years. Right? Hanania feels no fidelity to facts or to providing much evidence to his points. Now, he is good at social media if good you rate in terms of attention getting. I like how he dedicated his life to this, but he has so little to show for it. 81 followers on X, 53 subscribers on YouTube, a man of principle. Well, Hanania, like most modern gurus, is very interested in his metrics. All right. He feels that his worth is determined by the number of people who follow him and pay attention to him. Some people live for higher things than metrics. Some people, for example, I may be naive, but what I try to do is to tell the truth. That's my number one priority on this show. It's not getting attention. It's not striking heroic poses. This election is between one side that threatens capitalism. The Democratic Party doesn't threaten capitalism, and another that threatens democracy. The Republican Party does not threaten democracy. He's not a serious thinker. He is a poser. Capitalism is both more important and much more fragile. No one else is going to give it to you this straight. He is delusional about his abilities. Catholic post-liberalism really attracts the best minds, such penetrating insights into the modern condition. Seething at Starbucks and avocado toast. Well, there are very smart Catholic post-liberals, and there are less intelligent Catholic post-liberals. Right? The idea that you discredit Catholic post-liberalism by pointing out one less than stellar essay is not particularly strong. Alex Jones now promoting the idea that his fans should escape to Russia to gain their freedom. Yeah, so Richard Hanania used to be quite positively disposed to Alex Jones. For years and years and years, Richard Hanania was positively disposed towards Alex Jones. Richard Hanania does not have the greatest ability to detect truth from falsehood. In his latest podcast, he talked about how he kept doubling down and betting that Joe Biden would stay in office and be the Democratic representative for the 2024 presidential campaign. And why did he do this? Because it was really important to him to show to the world his superior forecasting skills, right? It's really important for him to demonstrate to the world that he is a superior man. So who was Richard Hanania referring to with regard to the small metrics? You'll have to check out Richard Hanania's Twitter feed, right? The exact name isn't important. It's just, it's a tell that you're dealing with an attention seeker, grifter, typically slippery guru, and they're all about the metrics, and that they have many higher values than talking about what is true.
Yeah, and a lot of people make it seem like this was an accident. He says it was proposed as a joke, and then just says, despite Representative Smith's intentions, the amendment passed, as did the Civil Rights Act, which, like, sort of leads to the question of why a joke amendment would pass.
Yeah.
And the answer is that when the amendment was proposed, Martha Griffiths, one of the few female representatives at the time, rallies support, convinces LBJ to...
Right, Hanania is not particularly interested in what really happened, right? He's just using history to try to come up with stories that aggrandize himself.
To support the amendment, they get all this momentum, and then it becomes part of the bill. So the story is told on the left as sort of like a tale of hubris, right?
I do love the idea of like, this is so far out there, pretty soon they're going to start saying that women are unequal in society too. Like,
right.
I'm going to call your bluff.
They've been doing this forever, where it's like, what's next?
Okay, let's look at the chat. The gap between Tucker Carlson and Alex Jones has narrowed to an embarrassing degree. It has. Right, much of what Tucker produces is pathetic. What do I make of Trump's remark to evangelicals? We'll fix things so you won't even have to vote in 4 years. I think it's just a throwaway line talking about he's going to go to war to protect them and to protect their hero system, to protect their values, and to protect their interests.
The way he's framing this is like, this is a weird fluke that this sort of tells us something about how like off kilter discrimination law is, but like, isn't this actually just a story of political will?
Yeah.
It's not an accident that the amendment gets passed. It's the result of people who support it mobilizing for something they believe in.
I do like the idea of some laws basically being mulligans. You're like, oh, this one doesn't count. Nobody really wanted this one.
He's trying to make this argument that like elites and bureaucrats have taken the simple law and turned.
So for Richard Hanania, arguments like everything else in his life are simply things like people for him to use for his own aggrandizement, right? There's nothing higher than his own aggrandizement, which makes him an unreliable intellectual and observer.
Trump, and they just thought he'd never win. So, but that is different, Mark, to your point of like why Democrats kind of feel this way. It's like, aha, somebody is really on offense using, his act against him. I don't know if it'll work in the election, but you can feel it in the Democratic Party.
Look, Hillary moved really slowly. I mean, remember those things where it'd be like, it would take 6 hours for someone to approve a tweet in the Clinton campaign. That's obviously right. No, but the circumstances are clear that this is a nimbler campaign. It has to be of necessity because they need to make an impact instantly. But as I say, I don't know that there might be diminishing returns from that. I don't know.
They're less afraid of making mistakes than the Clinton campaign was, which, Trump makes a lot of mistakes, so it's okay to make mistakes. Sue, welcome back. Remind everybody who you're supporting, where you are, and ask for speak.
I have a question. I currently live in Colorado, and I will be supporting Harris. I have two questions. The first one is about North Carolina. So let me start, and then I'll let my colleagues go.
Okay.
Hillary would have won if Jim Comey hadn't interceded.
Right. So Donald Trump won 2016 in large part by a fluke, right? If that election had been run 10 times, he probably would have won once out of 10 times.
Biden barely beat Trump. So drawing broad lessons about sort of what it all means from 16 to 20 till now, I think is a little bit misleading. But both those elections could have gone the other way, and you don't want to sort of overlearn. The country's very divided. Trump does have a ceiling, but under the right circumstances, Trump can win even with a ceiling on his support. The Democrats have run 3 candidates, and we'll see how good a candidate Harris ends up beating. But there's no doubt that in Clinton and Biden, Trump was lucky in running against relatively weak candidates, not powerhouse candidates, not Clinton, Bush, Obama, not just rising superstars. Now, a month ago, you would have said Harris would have been another gift to Trump. A month ago, you would have said, how could the Democrats possibly find a way to dislodge Biden and replace him with another deeply flawed candidate? So far, that's not what she appears to be. But
is that Harris is giving an opportunity on policy. She doesn't know how to not be left wing, but he doesn't know how to run against a left winger because Biden isn't really a left winger and Hillary wasn't really a left winger. And the way to run against Harris is to run against her as a left winger. And that's not what's in his fingertips. Just like I said, the American people's populist centrism is not in Harris's fingertips. Trump doesn't know how to run an ideological campaign against somebody who is marinated, born, raised, and marinated in the left of the Democratic Party. And he's going to have to.
And liquid gold.
That's not. I'm sorry. That's not quite. That's not quite right. I mean, actually,
educate me.
No, between 2017 and 2020, real incomes in the United States went up for the first time in 20 years. That's a real thing. Didn't go up hugely, but there had been a kind of total stagnation in middle class wage growth, and that ended with the employment boom. He's not. I don't believe he gets credit for the employment boom, really, but he was president during it. So since that's the way we sometimes.
Where am I going wrong here? I mean, why do people think that he's going to tell the truth or help people if he lies all the time?
All right, Steve.
I'll explain. I got a quick answer for you. Okay. Things changed in this country in 1998 when the president of the United States stood in front of the American people and said, I did not have sex with that woman, and got away with it. And in 2011, 2012, Barack Obama said, if you want your doctor, you can keep your doctor. And that wasn't true. And that was a huge lie about the most consequential piece of public policy in a generation.
And he knew in advance. He knew in advance it was a lie, and he said it for political gain.
Right. So what I'm saying is Trump came along at the end of a period in which the American people lost faith that politicians were going to tell them the truth. A lot of Democrats believe that Bush lied us into Iraq. I don't, but that's another aspect of this. And so if you put this all together, Trump comes along and says, they're all full of shit. They've all been full of shit forever. And then when he lies, and then people say, well, Trump lies a lot, The Trump people who support Trump are like, don't tell me that he lies. I sat here and listened to Bill Clinton lied to my face and Barack Obama lied to my face. All politicians lie. You can't hold Trump to a different standard. He's for me and they weren't. That's my answer to you. I'm not.
That is a great answer. You have to understand Donald Trump and his lies in a certain context, right? It's not like he's the first major politician to come along and lie, all right? There have been so many substantial lies told by Trump's predecessors that Trump supporters are willing to give him a pass.
Turned it into something much more sprawling and pernicious than anyone at the time has envisioned.
Great point in the chat. Perhaps the great tragedy in the trajectory of individuals such as Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens is the discrediting effect upon the legitimate points that they raise. Right. Candace Owens used to do great work. For years, she did great work. It was on a mid-level IQ, right, for a 100 IQ audience, but she did do a lot of great work.
This is like the big theme of his book, that this is all very divorced from the will of the people. These liberal bureaucratic elites have taken control of civil rights law.
Right.
He focuses on 4 outputs of the Civil Rights Act: affirmative action, disparate impact, harassment law, and Title IX. For our purposes, we're going to focus on the...
Right. It would have been really nice if Hanania had done his work and paid, great fidelity to the facts so that you could have confidence when you're reading something that he's written that this is someone who cares about getting it right. But Hanania does not care about getting it right. He cares about advancing his own attention.
In the middle two, again, disparate impact and harassment law, there is a section titled Disparate Impact. Everything is illegal.
Yep, I remember this from civics, the anti-purge.
So basically, Civil Rights Act made discrimination in employment illegal, but it didn't define what counts as discrimination, really. Everyone knew that you couldn't just say whites only in hiring anymore, right? But what about job requirements that aren't explicitly discriminatory, but still disproportionately impact Black people, for example, right? Enter the Supreme Court.
I have a podcast to recommend about this institution.
I'm going to send you something. This is a quick summary that Hanania provides.
Okay, Peter Schweitzer has probably done the best background investigation of Kamala Harris of any journalist I know. He was just interviewed.
She was running against the incumbent, a guy named Terrence Hallinan.
Right, talking about her entry into politics in 2003.
Terrence Hallinan was a progressive and he was a Democrat, but he really kind of wanted to hold powerful people into account. He didn't matter to him who those people were. He had launched a couple of investigations and was in the middle of prosecuting several of Willie Brown's friends. Willie Brown, of course, who had been the head of the California Assembly, was now the mayor of San Francisco. Terrence Hallinan was investigating his friends. Hallinan was also investigating the problem of priest sex abuse that was rocking the country at the time. He had gotten documents from the San Francisco diocese. He had gotten documents from a very powerful prep school there called St. Ignatius. And he was getting ready to A, prosecute people, and B, take those internal documents, scrub the names of victims, and publicize them. So needless to say, Terrence Hallinan was ruffling a lot of feathers in very powerful positions. So what basically happened is Kamala Harris ran against Terrence Hallinan, and she had the full backing of the mayor, Willie Brown, with whom she had previously had a romantic relationship, and also some very powerful people in San Francisco who were connected to that Catholic school who wanted the scandal to go away. They poured gobs of money into her campaign. Willie Brown got the local unions energized, and she literally came out of nowhere. She was not known in San Francisco, and she beat Terrence Hallinan. What happened? She got into power. She dropped the charges against all of Willie Brown's friends. Some of these charges involved public safety. One of his friends was selling subpar concrete for the construction of things like parking garages and bridges. That could end in disaster. The other thing that she did was she deep-sixed any investigation or exposure of the priestly abuse case in the Bay Area. So the bottom line is that the genesis of her political career, it was all about cover-up. It was all about insiders putting her into power. And for all the talking that she does about, being concerned about justice and protecting innocent victims, that certainly was not the case when she ran for office and she achieved that position. But the same sort of problems occurred when she became the California Attorney General as well.
You know what? And it's so scary because the thing is they're promoting her as somebody that she's not. Her policy, everything that she's doing, and being a Californian and somebody who had run for office in the past, I saw firsthand that I was being supported by grassroots supporters, the people, where piles of money from corporations and lobbyists are what supports these campaigns. In your opinion, Peter, how dangerous is it for this country if Kamala Harris were to become president?
Well, if you look in the space of her position as prosecutor, you see that she covers up for political allies and she goes after her political enemies. I mean, look at when she became California Attorney General in 2010. One of the things that was happening around the country is there were investigations taking place of health nutrition supplement companies for making faulty, exaggerated claims about what their products would do. The Department of Justice was looking at it, the Federal Trade Commission in Washington, D.C., and her office in San Diego said, we need to investigate these companies. They're located in California. We've done it as it regards other industries. We need to go after these 6 companies and investigate. Kamala Harris shut it down. Totally out of character for her. Why did she do it? Well, it turns out that, lo and behold, her husband's law firm, Venable, represented all 6 of those companies. So literally those investigations of those companies went away. And I would argue it's because Kamala Harris's husband was the managing partner of the Venable office in Los Angeles at the time. Look at some of the other things that she did. There was a nonprofit hospital chain in California that was run by the Sisters of Mercy. They wanted to sell it to another nonprofit because they couldn't afford to run it anymore. The problem is that that nonprofit that wanted to buy it did not want the Service Employees International Union to organize because they said they couldn't afford it. They couldn't run the hospitals with it. This is a nonprofit who worked with the California Nurses Association, had endorsements from the National Organization of Women because they had said, if we buy this chain of hospitals, we will maintain consistent services. We will not eliminate any. The fact that they would not allow the SEIU to unionize led Kamala Harris, who had the authority, to block that sale. And what ended up happening is this hospital chain that was going to go to a nonprofit was bought by a hedge fund in New York. Kamala Harris did approve of that transaction because the hedge fund owners were Democrat donors. And of course, they allowed SEIU to unionize. The problem is that the hospital chain shut down and restricted a lot of services. So my point is that she goes after her opponents. She supports her powerful friends. That's certainly what she does as a law enforcement official, as a prosecutor. And I can expect as a president, she would continue to wield power in the same way.
And we've seen a lot of that. We've seen this with President Trump, with all the lawfare laid out against him. We've seen it against American citizens. And I do know that Kamala, at one point, there were some investigations.
Okay, there's growing talk online about Kamala Harris having a drinking problem.
Our extraordinary President Joe Biden. He's going to speak in a minute, but there's a lot of love in this room for our president.
All right, she definitely likes to drink. Right? Does she have a drinking problem? Not known, but it's getting talked about on social media. It might explain, ditzy, silly behavior on her part publicly. So we know she likes drinking. We don't know how much, if any, of a drinking problem that she has. So something worth looking into. The bigger point is that she's not being thoroughly vetted. And so we're going to find out all sorts of things about Kamala Harris that we don't really know yet. But she's not been thoroughly vetted. Tim Walz has not been thoroughly vetted. Her husband has not been thoroughly vetted. I suspect that we're going to find out a lot more about Kamala Harris, and it's not going to be to her advantage because right now, just looking at the state of the race, you'd have to say that Kamala Harris is the favorite. But we're going to find out more. Talk to you later.